Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. A tale as old as time. A song as old as... Wait a minute, wrong Disney princess. Nonetheless, it still stands that this is an incredibly old story. Beginning as a Germanic fairy tale written in 1812 by the Brothers Grimm, the narrative of Snow White was adapted over 100 years later by Walt Disney Productions. The 1937 full-length animated feature film was the first of its kind, ushering in a new renaissance of animation. What was initially deemed a massive box office gamble at the time of release became such a smash hit that Disney re-released the film 8 more times. Since then, Snow White has become an indelible pop culture icon, appearing in countless adaptations, retellings, and even having cameos in other fantasy films. So when Disney began creating live-action adaptations of their classic animated films in 2015 with the release of Cinderella, movie-going audiences knew it was only a matter of time before our singing, dwarf-loving, fruit-tasting princess would get her own realistic reimagining. We'll be discussing all of this and more on this week's episode of Studio Cinema Saturday, the show where we review films old and new, the ones you don't like and the ones that you do. I'm your host, Dalton Sherrill, and today we'll be discussing 2025 Snow White, directed by Marc Webb. Now, if you've seen the show before, you know that I'm at least gonna spew some surface level info about today's director. And considering I didn't know who Marc Webb was prior to making this video, I was thoroughly surprised at some of the notches he has on his director belt. Back in 2009, he directed a romance film titled 500 Days of Summer. While I haven't seen this movie, I frequently see stills from it being used in memes, as well as it appearing on various people's favorite movie lists. So I think it's safe to say it's a bit of a modern classic. Not only that, love them or hate them, Webb directed both amazing Spider-Man films, and was even brought on as a creative consultant for Spider-Man Homecoming alongside Sam Raimi. Pretty cool stuff. Just with this very brief overview of his career, you see his experience in romance and fantasy, so it makes sense why he was chosen to direct this live-action fairy tale. But without further ado, what are my spoiler-free thoughts on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Well, let me make this immediately apparent. I don't hate this movie like the critics and a percentage of moviegoers do. Do I think it's Disney's best live-action adaptation? No, probably not. And I believe I've only seen Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast. Is it a faithful adaptation of the original story? For the most part, yes. In this interpretation, Snow White gets her own backstory set before she's the once princess, now servant girl to the evil queen. We find out what happened to her parents, learn about the evil queen's takeover of the kingdom, and even get a little exposition on how Snow White got her iconic name. As a longtime childhood fan of the original film, questions like what happened to Snow White's parents might pop into one's mind, but in this version, her parents, particularly Snow White's father, becomes a driving force for Snow White's unyielding selflessness and the choices that she makes throughout the film. I like seeing how her backstory influenced the person she became, but at the same time, I don't think all the exposition was necessary, seeing as how it wasn't there the first time. Now, as I'm sure everyone's wondering, how are the performances? I'm just gonna start by saying I think Rachel Zegler was the perfect choice for Snow White. If you're not familiar with Miss Zegler, she starred as Maria in 2021's West Side Story, so I think it was a smart casting decision to put her in another musical role. Gal Gadot, an actress perhaps best known for her role as Wonder Woman in the 2 Wonder Woman films and 2 Justice League films, plays the evil queen. Now in the OG film, Snow White's kinda just this ultra-feminine, run-of-the-mill princess character with this high-pitched singing voice. I'm wishing. And she's very dainty and light, very much your classic damsel in distress, which is a commonality amongst these old tales. The evil queen, on the other hand, is cold, domineering, heartless even, and while Zegler brought this fresh depiction of Snow White by making her this activist in opposition of this cruel monarch, Gadot's portrayal of the evil queen feels a little forced. She feels like someone trying to be this vile ruler, but she can't quite commit to the bit. Additionally, I feel like her Israeli accent kinda sticks out like a sore thumb in her performance. However, on the contrary, I do think it contributes to the backstory they give her in context of the film. But nonetheless, I thought her musical numbers and the costume they put her in were top notch. Magic mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest SCS host of all?
Why, it's none other than Kale McCall.
No, that can't be right. Do it again. Nah, I'm just kidding. That's all you, baby. But overall, aside from the subplots about Snow White's origin, the rebels of the crown, a reworked plot involving the prince, or rather the thief that serves as her love interest, and a slight change to the film's resolution, it's a relatively faithful adaptation of the 1937 film. There are numerous instances of direct shots being ripped straight from the animated film, and I absolutely love that. Moments such as the storybook opening at the beginning of the film, Snow White escaping into the forest, and everything from the trees to the animals in the forest being this acid trip nightmare, and the evil queen's descent into her lair to brew the potion that disguises her as the peddler woman. All of that and more is spot on to the original, and I think it'll satisfy Disney fans old and new. All of that being said, the last thing I'll discuss before spoiling the socks off this movie is, of course, the Seven Dwarfs themselves. Now, they're kind of a mixed bag. Just on first glance, they slip and fall into the uncanny valley a bit. But all things considered, it's not the worst CGI I've ever seen. In fact, I think they blend in perfectly with the environment, which is probably also mostly CGI, but I digress. I think there was a conversation about casting little people as dwarfs, but I think that very quickly became scrapped due to backlash from Peter Dinklage and others who found that decision regressive. Conversely, other little people have gone on the record to say that statements like that take away from the work they get to perform in the industry. Do I think these live-action Disney films could use less CGI? Yes, very much so. Would I have liked to see actual little people portray dwarves? Yeah, it probably would have been a good idea. However, the CGI animals, on the other hand, really don't look that bad. But enough of this spoiler-free talk. If you don't want spoilers for a remake of a 78-year-old film based on a 200-year-old story, hop on a magical woodland creature of your choice and get the hell out of here. Starting with Snow White's origin, I'm torn between whether we really needed this backstory or if it's a cool addition to her character. Now, with Snow White being such a distinct name, I do like the detail that she was born during this immense snowstorm that the kingdom had to endure. And when she's like maybe 8 or 9, Snow White and her parents have this whole song and dance in which they're interacting with the townspeople and baking apple pies for everyone, and we see that from a very young age her parents have instilled these hardworking, selfless characteristics into her. I feel like in the writer's room they were like, what could Snow White be making for the poor? What about pies? And what if they were apple pies? It'll be symbolic of her choking on her kindness, and the fruits of her labor will inevitably lead to her demise. It's genius! But jumping back to her childhood, the narrative of her mom's passing, which resulted in the king taking a new wife who is this mysterious and beautiful woman from a foreign land that seduced people with her magic tricks, I can dig that. There's this theme in the original story of Snow White in which she's wishing for a better life as she sings into a well. And there's some added significance in this adaptation, as we see she used to do this with her parents, and their reflections gradually fade from the water. Additions that were made to aspects of the narrative that were present in the original animated film seem to be some of the strongest material in this adaptation, especially when it comes to the extended song lyrics. And speaking of the music, I think I love 75 to 80% of the songs. Lots of beautiful sets of pipes, dancing, choreography, the whole 9 yards. These are the things that Disney really excels at. In fact, I love the music so much that I've decided to make my own club rap parodies of my favorite songs from the film. The track list includes Waiting on a Paycheck, High Hose, and my personal favorite, Whistle While You Twerk.
Whistle while you twerk. Go ahead and start and make them pussy forward and whistle while you twerk.
Another change that was made from the original story is that instead of this Prince Charming sort of character, we get Jonathan, the leader of a band of thieves that steal in the name of Snow White's father. Snow White helps him escape after he steals the queen's potatoes, and the two engage in a little romance plot while on the run from the queen. The prince was always a strange aspect of the animated film for me because he shows up at the very beginning of the film, flirts with Snow White, and doesn't show up again until the film's conclusion. I like to imagine he just showed up and started talking to the dwarfs like,
"Howdy, gents. How's my favorite girl? You know, the one I flirted with for 2 minutes a couple months ago? What do you mean she's dead? Poisonous apple? Hey, do you guys mind? I'm just gonna kiss her anyways. Wait, Snow, you're alive? Well, the course of my evening's been dramatically and irrevocably altered. Come along, you deceptively young princess. Away to my castle we go.
While their story makes so much more sense in this adaptation, that doesn't make it a more captivating narrative. To me, it feels like the Walmart version of what occurs in Tangled between Rapunzel and Flynn Rider. Not only that, Jonathan's band of brigands are the most cookie-cutter, unmemorable fantasy characters ever, except for the crossbow guy. He actually does something of import. Moving toward the end of my review, I'm gonna talk a little more about the dwarfs, a little more about the queen, and discuss the ending of the film and why it isn't my favorite. And then I'll score the movie. Aside from the appearance of the dwarfs, I think they're pretty okay. Their voice actors are really solid, their musical numbers are fun, and they have these weird powers that reveal gemstones? Huh, that's strange. But I must admit, when I heard the first note of Hi-Ho in the theater, I was grinning ear to ear. This version of the song captures the essence of the original and transports you back to the moment you first heard it as a child. Nonetheless, I think you lose something by putting them in a live-action setting. I think their slapstick, humor, and distinct personalities are ultimately just stronger in the original. However, I do think certain dwarfs capture the essence of the original characters, such as Grumpy, Doc, Happy, and Dopey. Speaking of Dopey, since the film delves into themes of class struggle and acting against oppressive institutions, I think it was powerful to have him speak for the first time in this version, as a way of demonstrating him surmounting his fear. On to the evil queen. I really enjoy how they handled her transformation, everything from the shot of her going down the dungeon steps to brew the potion, the swirling of the green smoke, and even the CGI of her transforming and aging before our very eyes was honestly pretty cool and accurate to the original. Gal Gadot's old hag voice could use some work, but that's a minor nitpick. I love her interaction with Snow White when she gets to the cottage, but this is where we start to divulge from the original ending. And if you don't remember the original ending, allow me to refresh your memory. Snow White takes a bite of the apple and collapses on the floor. The birds and other forest creatures witness this and start hauling ass to go tell the dwarves. They race through the forest, scoop them up on some deer, and the dwarves quickly get the memo that something's happened to Snow White. They catch the queen leaving the cottage and Grumpy's like, "There's that bitch!" And they proceed to chase her up a mountain until she attempts to roll a giant boulder on top of them. Then lightning strikes the cliff she's standing on, which causes her to fall to her death. If nothing else, one thing's for sure. These 7 dwarfs were standing on business. They were all like, "You f*** with Snow and we'll throw it back 7 times mo." But seriously, they have way less of an impact in this version. Doc saves Jonathan from a non-fatal arrow wound, and they show up at the end to help dethrone the queen. But in truth, they were just there for moral support, because they don't even do anything. Lastly, the evil queen's death in this version was just so lame. Furthermore, I don't like the fact that she just turns back into her original self. Let's remind ourselves, what was she trying to accomplish?
Magic mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest of them all?
She had to relinquish her own beauty by becoming the peddler and trick Snow White into eating the apple. She won, but at what cost? Because let's be honest with ourselves. In the animated film, if she could truly turn back into herself, don't you think she would have? She probably could have used that extra speed to get away from the dwarfs. Food for thought. Nonetheless, her destroying the mirror and turning to dust just felt like a cop-out death. Yay! Snow White's able to overthrow an evil regime using pacifism. And as my first act as queen, I decree that everyone shall only wear the color white, in remembrance of how I saved us all. This is the least colorful scene in a Disney film. The end. So yeah, that's what I thought about the movie. There's some good, there's some bad. And we focus too much on Snow White's dad. I think I'll give the film 6 sleeping death apples out of 10. I believe there's more working in the film than there isn't, but it's like a 60-40 split. It has some standout performances, captivating musical numbers, and some noteworthy instances of paying homage to the original. But despite this, it relies heavily on CGI that's sometimes questionable, tells a weaker story that beats you on the head with its agenda, and fails to have intriguing side characters, with even the dwarfs sometimes appearing as hollow versions of themselves. I wonder what the critics thought. I'm almost 99% sure they absolutely fawned over this movie. Oh, that's bad. That's really bad. But no, for real, what happened to the ratings for this movie? They are criminally low, even if the movie is a little lackluster at times. I'd recommend giving it a watch if you're a huge Disney nut or if you're just dying to see this story in live action. It's probably the best live action adaptation of Snow White, even though it isn't perfect. But at the end of the day, I'd recommend just hopping on Disney Plus and watching the original. It still holds up in 2025, and ultimately, it's just the better film. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Studio Cinema Saturday. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, drop a like on this video, and let us know your favorite Disney princess in the comments section down below. Mine is the Queen Xenomorph, for all of you wondering. And as always, we'll see you at the next watch.